Hello, this is Stephen Shaw, interim chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University, and welcome to Building Research Relevance. This episode is going to talk a little bit about how do exploratory and qualitative research fit into this model of building relevance. Some of it's easy, some of it's hard, so we'll just talk a little bit about some aspect of it today. And especially, this is especially important for clinical types of work or clinically relevant research or research that should be more relevant in a clinical setting. I will say this is a big topic because I've gotten a lot of pushback about many open science programs such as pre-registration. Well, that's probably the biggest one. People would say, I don't want to do a register reports for a journal or pre-registration because I do exploratory work. Well, this is really not a good excuse. It's not really a reason why you shouldn't engage in open science practices. As I mentioned before, I think open science, we should stop calling it that. That just is science. It's the other one that's the opaque, trust me science, which is the opposite of what science is about. So I think it's fairly simple. Rather than to say we cannot put forth hypotheses because this is not a confirmatory deductive style study. It's exploratory or it's qualitative. This is fine, but it's not a good reason. As we know, qualitative work can be inductive because what tends to happen is there's a clinical problem or a context in which a clinical problem becomes an issue. People see it in practice. It comes up over and over again. There's not a good solution. Therefore, some form of descriptive work that involves inductive reasoning, a bottom-up approach, is taken to just understand this better. Inductive or exploratory or qualitative science tends to be a little bit more flexible and adaptive in its methods than does deductive or confirmatory science, and that's not a problem. This happens all the time. A lot of surveys tend to do this. We see a lot of surveys of, let's find out what people think about X, Y, or Z. And these surveys are great, but inductive methods still are appropriate for an open science approach. They still lack relevance as it is now. I say this because I have colleagues, and we all have colleagues as you research, who talk about qualitative methods. And qualitative methods are fine, but the argument of this is better than that are really silly. Qualitative methods ask certain types of questions using mostly inductive reasoning. They're very, very popular, especially in clinical areas like counseling psychology is largely qualitative work because things like context and ideas such as that in describing clinical context are very, very important. So that's fine, but yeah, the qualitative versus quantitative thing I find extraordinarily silly. It's just whether you're going to use an inductive or deductive approach. Exploratory versus confirmatory is another way to say that. The bottom-up approach is perfectly fine. However, it still can be part of an open science building relevance approach. Just because you're interviewing people, and as we make fun of our qualitative researchers because they often refer to things as a rich tapestry, which I find amusing that that's the phrase that's used so often. But they do have the advantage of qualitative work is it's context specific for certain groups at certain times in certain contexts. This is actually a wonderful component. It has potential to actually be involved in theory building. This is kind of the big part of exploratory research as part of the scientific enterprise. It's not a problem. It's not an issue. You can be open with it because inductive science is real science too. But just like quantitative types of methods and deductive science has significant problems of not being involved with enough theory testing or theory building, I think this is the exact same problem that we see with exploratory, inductive, qualitative types of research, that there's not really a theory behind it. And this is fine. To some degree, this is part of the advantages of qualitative research, in that to do qualitative research really well and to analyze the results, you have to have a theory before it, a theory of qualitative research, whether it's a phenomenological approach or a field theory approach, and there's many, many others. But you have to have a theory. You have to be mindful about it. The funny thing is there's mindful ideas of theories of qualitative research, but often not a theory built based on the content of what you are researching. Inductive approaches, this bottom-up approach, can be super helpful for theory building. And we need to have, to really improve and maximize the theoretical relevance and the clinical relevance, we need to think of all of our inductive or exploratory research as how this builds theory. Like I say, it typically doesn't test a theory with a deductive model, but it's inductive. So you have bottom up, big picture to small, and by doing this, you're really building theory. So I'd like to see more qualitative papers help build a theory, build a part of a theory, build components of a theory. This is really the exciting, or add on to existing theories by basing it on certain contexts, certain populations, certain perceptions. This is really the positive component of it. And right now, I don't really see that. I think people just say qualitative as opposed to quantitative. Not really. It's part of the same process. But let's see, and let's start working on building models. Let's start building theories as part of this inductive exploratory approach. We can still use things like pre-registration. We can still use things like sharing of data. We can still use components such as sharing methods and being extremely transparent. Some of the issues are that if we do a qualitative approach, some of these specific contexts may be identifiable. This is true in some aspects. We need to be very cautious, and we need to be very cautious on how we put together an informed consent form so we can share qualitative data on some mechanism out there like the OSF platform or many, many other repositories for data. So you do have to change your informed consent a little bit to account for the sharing of qualitative data that needs to be a little bit more careful than the clearly anonymous quantitative data, especially large-scale quantitative data. But you can still pre-register, not because you're pre-registering on hypothesis, but you can pre-register the expected boundaries of the new phenomenon that you're investigating. And this is one of the big parts. Say I'm investigating something brand new, I'm doing some interviews about this or doing some case studies about this idea. You can still pre-register this phenomenon and say, here's what we expect. Now, by putting out the boundaries of what you expect, it's not really important that you're right or wrong about the predictions, but what it's really important is that you're transparent about what you've put forth as the boundaries expected of the phenomenon based on other research of similar areas, assuming you're looking at a brand new concept. So this is what you want to focus on. What are those boundaries? I think we get so enamored with simply being right that my hypotheses are correctly predictive, when we realize that that's not really what hypotheses are for. Therefore, testing one idea versus another. Either we find that the description of this phenomenon places us directly in this boundary that we predicted, or it's outside. Both are equally valuable. So I think we get tired or I think we're afraid to be wrong, when in fact that rightness or wrongness isn't really the purpose of hypotheses. It's simply to talk about, we expect things to fall within this boundary of what this phenomenon might look like based on what we've already seen or previous research or previous clinical observations, for example. And by doing this, what we really help head off is sort of a qualitative version or an inductive exploratory version of Harkin, which is you find one weird person who has a strange idea that you interview, and therefore you use that to build a theory based on one odd person, one odd thing, or a misunderstanding of an interview question. All sorts of weird stuff can happen that you can cherry pick. Well, that's really problematic. And I know that doesn't happen very often, thankfully, but it does happen at times, especially when you're using exploratory methods. So one of the big parts of exploratory methods, create a boundary in advance, report that boundary. And if things fall outside the boundary, that's fine. But also have your methods very, very clear as to how you're going to describe the new phenomenon there. Whether it's a survey that may be qualitative or quantitative, whether it's interviews, whether it's whatever it is. Doesn't matter quantitative, qualitative, but what does matter is that it's inductive versus deductive. So this type of exploratory research certainly fits well within a framework of open science, fits well within a framework of pre-registration. But we have to get out of the idea that that predictions have to be right. What we really need is those predictions to be useful. And what's useful is to describe exactly how we're going to analyze the data, exactly how we're going to collect the data, and what are the expectations for the parameters of this phenomenon being described in the context that you're describing it. And once you have those in place, we can see how the actual results come out. But this is so much better than just cherry picking things left and right. And I'm very pleased to see that a lot of the really good research that's inductive and exploratory doesn't tend to do that. But it's really critical that we put this in place. So transparency is not just for deductive, quantitative studies that test specific hypotheses. It's also for describing new phenomenon. It's also for describing the context in which they occur, or the individuals who may be very different from a demographically typical population. All of these things are critically important, but by creating boundaries, you can find inductive reasoning is just as amenable to open science principles as is quantitative work. But as in all research, it becomes more relevant the more you tie it to theory. In deductive, we tend to test theory or have competing theories. In inductive, we tend to create theories or create additions onto old theories. But unless we do those two things, you're really not getting maximum relevance for what you're doing in your work. So to build research relevance, exploratory, qualitative is no different than quantitative, deductive, hypothesis testing types of, null hypothesis testing types of studies. They're exactly the same when it comes to the need for transparency and the need for theoretical basis. Once you have those two things, you have credibility and you have relevance. And so that's the idea that exploratory and qualitative work is not exempt. It's part of the scientific enterprise. And I hope my colleagues who do that type of work really value this component. It really does give this type of research a meaning and value and relevance. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time here on Building Research Relevance.